So this is about the top 10 unexpected ways I pwned you, which is basically about how over the last few years I've focused on finding those things that vulnerability scanners overlooked, as well as what a lot of pen testers didn't know to look for in the past. And I'll admit up front that I did not discover any of these methods. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, so I figure I work harder and learn all the methodology that I can and read as much as I can and soak up, and keep adding these new tools to my toolbox that I'm about to share with you here in a moment. So who am I? I'm a senior security consultant at SecureCon. I used to work with Patrick at Rapid7, and now I'm working at SecureCon, where I mainly work on the critical infrastructure services team. A lot of work for like oil and gas utilities, air gap networks, stuff like that. Retired Navy aviation electrician. I worked on H-60 helicopters for most of that 20 years. And I'm a Harley Davidson enthusiast. I don't quite qualify as a biker, just an enthusiast, because I'm a wimp. I won't ride in the rain if I can avoid it, or the extreme cold. So, and this is me every winter with my friends sitting around the fire pit drinking beer and talking about the fun times we had and what we're going to do next year. So, some notable things about where I've come from as far as going from being in the Navy, working in aviation, to information security and now pen testing, is the first vulnerability I ever found in the wild. I found while in the Navy through a printed Navy form. So at the time, I was going to school at night to finish my degree, computer information systems with a focus on networking and security management. And at night, I was learning about things like OWASP Top 10, insecure direct object reference, SQL injection, stuff like that. So I went to the Navy college office to pick up my tuition assistance form. I got an email saying it had been approved. And I go to pick it up, and that weekend I'm sitting around at the house and I'm looking at this form. You know how on Internet Explorer, by default, it would print at the bottom of the page the URL if you printed a web page. And I was looking at that, and this long URL ended in ID equals and some string of digits. And I was like, that looks familiar. Maybe SQL injection? Who knows? So I painstakingly typed out that whole URL in my browser. And I was planning on typing it in, and then after hitting enter, adding a single quote to it to test for SQL injection, which in hindsight was a really bad idea because, I'm in the Navy. They owned my rear. I could have gotten in a lot of trouble. But I was really surprised when I hit the enter key, and up pops a lot of personal information about me stored in their system. So it was basically an insecure direct object reference that I found, an IDOR vulnerability. And I was like, wow, what's this? So I looked it over and I'm like, wow, there's enough information here for somebody to steal my identity. And this is a website that was exposed to the internet, not just confined to DoD networks. So I changed the last number in the ID digits, and I'm looking at somebody else's information. All this from a printed form. I was just curious at the time. So I changed it again and saw yet somebody else's information. I'm thinking, somebody who's malicious could write a script to automate this and basically harvest, hundreds of thousands of people's, personally identifying information, because it basically had everybody in the Navy and Marine Corps who had ever used tuition assistance for college had their information in there. So the funny thing was, I sat on it for like 2 weeks before I reported it because I was scared I was going to get in trouble. So I finally reported it, and then for weeks, nothing. It was like a big nothing. And so months later, I go back in to pick up my next tuition assistance form. And I asked the lady, I said, did anything ever come of this? And she says, not that I know of, they haven't said anything to us. And then she hands me my completed form. And you know how they remediated this? They simply turned off Internet Explorer, printing the URL at the bottom of the form. So anyway, moving right along. So what's the purpose of this presentation? Years ago, when I first got the OSC OSCP certification. I remember when I got my first pen testing job, and I was really scared that I, quote, couldn't hack it, that I would be lame or that people would think I sucked or whatever. And I remember looking in the OSCP forums, the one you get access to after you pass the test, and seeing somebody posting about this. And he said that he got put on one external pen test after another. And he just wasn't finding anything because he was testing, obviously, networks that have been repeatedly scanned with Nessus or whatever vulnerability scanner, and it had been hit up by however many pen testers came before him. And he was worried about not being able to hack it. And so I remember when I became a consultant, I would just read all the reports I could find and constantly taking notes, trying to come up with new things to add to my toolbox, like methodology that other pen testers used. So, but over time, my focus developed from not being lame to just trying to provide more value for my clients. The client can find hundreds and hundreds of pen test firms that that can run a scanner and generate a report. So I switched my focus to just trying to focus on those things where where vulnerability scanners would overlook or other pen testers typically overlooked. And that's what I'm going to be covering today. So the first one, I did this pen test of this website, and it was extremely narrow scope. So obviously one host, only ports 80 and 443 were open. I scanned it with a vulnerability scanner. I scanned it with Burp Suite Pro. And really the only thing I really found was TCP timestamps. This was a login form. And upon successful login, it would redirect you to a website that was not in scope. So, extremely narrow focus here. So basically after a day and a half of a 3-day assessment, I decided to go back to the beginning. And this is why it's so important to really do thorough OSINT. In case there's anybody in the audience that doesn't know what OSINT is, it's basically open source intelligence gathering. So why it's so important, no matter what type of assessment you do, to do thorough OSINT. And if you aren't finding anything, go back and do more OSINT. So I use a tool called TruffleHog, and basically I found, I'll back up for a second. Before I used TruffleHog, I found that this particular organization had a GitHub repository. So I used TruffleHog and downloaded the whole thing and grepped through it, and I found not only keys, like access keys, but also administrator credentials in some of those GitHub commits. So I went from a big nothing and to having basically administrator access. And from that point, the website I hit after the redirect was not in scope, but I did see before I exited out of there and took some screenshots and left it alone, that I was an administrator of multiple organizations that control the flow of money for those organizations. So wow, that was exposed to the internet, and that was a great example of pulling something out of nothing. Now, I actually just read an article like in the last couple of days that if you, there's so many people, malicious people even, that are scanning GitHub for secrets, that somebody did a test and committed some fake secrets or access keys to GitHub, and it was discovered, and somebody attempted to use them in like 11 minutes or something like that. Weak egress filtering. So some examples are, if you're not aware, you can embed in rich text format or HTML email in Outlook, embedding an HTML image tag in a signature that basically, instead of pointing to an HTTP link for the images, can point to, as you see here on the screen, an image source with an SMB URL. Even though this was supposedly patched by Microsoft back in, I believe, 2018, is what I was told, I'm still exploiting that this year. So here, this URL, this GitHub URL, there's add-in code for Outlook where you can create a button you can click that'll open up a new email and automatically you fill in the IP address of your host that's listening, and it'll insert those HTML or SMB links in your email in Outlook. Click send, and if your target has weak egress filtering, when they go to view the email in Outlook on Windows, it will basically send you their NTLM password hashes. It's very important. By the way, I failed to give some credit here. I'd like to thank, if he's out there, if he ever watches this recording, Jason Zafuto. I think Patrick might remember him. But Jason Zafuto helped me get my first consulting job. And he's the one that actually told me about this trick. But continuing on, it's definitely important that if you try this, that you communicate with the point of contact for your pen test, that you're going to do this, because you don't want there to be any surprises. If you don't communicate this in advance, there's a possibility that somebody could get very upset because you turned an external assessment into a phishing attack, basically. And looks like we have a comment. Let's see what it is. Or a question. No, this is not similar to a cross-site scripting attack. They're much different. Basically, cross-site scripting is you're embedding content into a web page, and this is basically embedding an SMB image tag into an email. And Outlook, by default, when you view the email, would attempt to retrieve those images to display them in Outlook. And when it connects to your server that's running, say, for example, Responder, or you can use things like Metasploit has an SMB server that'll work as well. It attempts to authenticate with your Windows credentials. So that's how they're different. One thing I found is on a kickoff call for an external assessment, when you communicate this, if you flat out tell them that if it works, and I'm going to have your NTLM password hash, I'm going to try to crack it and gain access, you may have a harder time getting them to agree to it. So it might be better, I mean, be completely honest, but you don't want to provide too much information. Just tell them you're going to send this email that's got some image tags, and you're simply going to check their firewall egress filtering. That's all you have to say. So moving right along.
Steve, on that one, do you talk about Scuffy later, or can I mention Scuffy?
No, Scuffy isn't mentioned in here. Are you talking about the SCF file that Scuffy will put, or is it a link file?
It's the module in crackmap exec. So yeah, Steve gave credit to others for this type of attack, and I also have to give credit to Steve because one of my favorite things that I do is very similar to what he just described, especially on internal networks. A lot of times I'll find internal network shares that are going to be writable either with really weak credentials or no credentials. And there is another way that you can do a very similar thing to what Steve just described here with a tool called crackmap exec. It has this module called Scuffy, where it puts in this little .scf file into the Microsoft network shares, which then anytime anybody inside of that network accesses one of those network shares, so obviously the more of them that you can hit, the better, it is then going to send you their network credentials to the listener that you have running. So that's one of the things that I remember Steve mentioning, like, oh, this would be really cool if there was a way to kind of do this. And I think you were even doing it manually for a while until you discovered, I think you discovered crackmap exec's Scuffy, and now that's something that I try to like just about always use.
Yeah, I remember dropping that in Slack back when we were working together. Yeah, so in fact, one of the most difficult internal pen tests I ever did, this customer really had everything locked down tight. I remember we got some non-privileged user credentials, and I used that Scuffy module to drop an SCF file on a network share with those user credentials, And the downfall of this company was they had one cowboy, or they referred to him as a cowboy on the client debrief, where this person would log into servers. They broke the rules and would log into servers with their domain admin account. And when they opened up Explorer, you know, they had a full log onto the server, not just using like remote server administration tools. But when they logged into the server, then they opened Explorer and went to browse to a file share to load some tools or download some software or whatever. And when they viewed the root of that file share where I dropped this SCF file using Scuffy, boom, I got their NTLM password hash, and I was able to crack it. And this actually happened on the last day, the last hour of a 5-day assessment. I thought that we were going to leave this with nothing but, you know, some very minor findings. And I actually had the terminal screen open on one screen, and my report I started writing on the other. And I thought we were basically done, you know, last hour, last day, this is it. And but I left that terminal running, and boom, I see that the hash roll by that we had dropped in using Scuffy, and heart rate and blood pressure instantly shot up, and had to hurry up to try to get some proof and everything, and escalate before that last hour was up. So good story. So Dimitri, I'm interested to hear what tips you have to make this more effective.
So I was going to say, one thing is, if you're using the IP address, you also want to try using some sort of DNS hostname instead of an IP address, in case the outbound filter picks up on people shouldn't be going directly to IP addresses. That was the main thing that I was thinking. There was something else, but then it blipped out of my head, and now I'm feeling an idiot. But mainly it's the try using host names or you know, and IP addresses interchangeably, because sometimes you might have luck with one and not the other. It depends. Even like if you're hosting something on Azure or AWS, they'll usually give you some generic, you know, gibberish domain that you can. You know, it's like, I think on Azure it's like whatever.azurewebsites.net or something. It's just like you don't even have to buy a domain name; it just is there, and not everybody would blacklist that.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that.
But some people would blacklist just direct IP callouts.
Okay, good to know. I actually did not know that, so I appreciate it. You know, some other ways you can do this is, for example, if you're doing a social engineering assessment, you can embed things in Microsoft Word documents. Like, for example, OLE, you can embed those OLE objects in emails and Outlook, in Word and Excel documents, for example, that point to an SMB link to retrieve the OLE content. In fact, I think when Microsoft patched this back in Outlook back in, I think, 2018, they basically only did a half job of patching it. For what I've read recently, even if patched, I think if you use an SMB link to OLE, I think it'll still work. I think they may have to click. It won't automatically load just by, you know, preview. So there's a lot of ways you can pull this off. This is just one of them. SMTP spoofing and open relays. So this is going to this slide deals with internal and external attacks. For example, weak SPF records, sender policy framework, and email. And I remember there was this SMTP server, and I've done this more than once. I'm just talking about one instance of this. I ran a vulnerability scan, and it didn't find anything about SMTP open relay or anything like that. So I was getting kind of desperate for findings. This is another pen test where, you know, things were kind of slim pickings, and they'd been scanned multiple times, picked over by pen testers in the past, and I was having a hard time. So I'm like, what do I got to lose? I telnetted to port 25 and started issuing SMTP commands, and I realized that although it wasn't acting as a full open relay, I couldn't relay from random addresses to other external random addresses. If I used a sender and a recipient that were internal to that organization, it actually worked. And so it's pretty easy to find a company's help desk email on the internet, and also to do some OSINT to find some other email addresses. And so you can imagine how this could be taken advantage of by a malicious person or a pen tester. And in both of these situations, internal and external SMTP spoofing and open relays, imagine what you can do with this. If nothing else, it's like maybe you get some credentials and they're using two-factor authentication. Spoof an email from the help desk to an admin or somebody or a user, and tell them that you're testing multi-factor authentication, and you just click allow during the next 5 minutes, and boom, you got access. Also in internal systems, this is one that although scanners will frequently find it on an internal pen test, it's frequently not remediated because people take it for granted. They think, oh, this is just a moderate, and it's a convenience thing when you leave open SMTP relays on an internal network, say for example, so printers can send emails. So in addition to doing things like using it like I've shown here to bypass MFA, at the very least, you need to tell your client, your point of contact, that you're going to verify that it's actually the open SMTP relay is not a false positive, and send them a test email, and then include those SMB image tags. If you're doing an internal pen test, there's no firewall egress to block you from getting those hashes. So yeah, there's been assessments in the past where not much was going on. I had slim pickings, very low severity findings, and basically pulled it out and escalated domain admin through attacks like this. And also, another lesson learned from this is don't trust your scanner that when you scan that port 25, that SMTP server, go play around with telnet to that port 25 and see what you can do. Try sending an email from an internal user to another one. If you can't harvest some addresses off the internet, just ask your point of contact to provide some addresses for testing. IPv6 DHCP, man in the middle to domain admin. So if you've ever heard of LLM&R, which is linked local multicast name resolution, and net bias name services. So, and then there's also WPAD. So by default, Microsoft Windows systems, before I get into IPv6 DHCP, man in the middle attack, it's necessary to explain what came before this and why this is the new thing. So Microsoft Windows systems, when a system does a DNS lookup, if it fails to resolve through the DNS server, then it will fail over by default to LLM&R, linked local multicast name resolution, or net bias name services, and it will do a broadcast on the local subnet. And but Microsoft patched this, so it's extremely rare that when you try to spoof that WPAD host that all Windows clients will try to connect to, when you open up Internet Explorer. Well, as of that patch, I think it came out in 2016, Windows will no longer send a password hash for WPAD over LLM&R or NVTNS. They will, however, send the password hash and attempt authentication if it resolved over DNS. And that's where this comes in. So here you see on the screen TCP dump that I ran, and you see these IP6 solicits, but there's no response to them. And if you look at the IPv6 address, I think these are linked local. I'm no expert on IP6. I could be wrong. Drop it in the chat. Let me know if I'm wrong. But this FE80, I think that's a linked local address that you automatically get assigned. And Windows now automatically has IPv6 enabled. So basically the way you would exploit this is, I've got a link here to man in the middle 6, which is a tool you would use to exploit it. And you would typically use that with something like NTLM relay x.py from a packet. And so you poison those IPv6 DHCP broadcasts, and you tell the Windows clients that you are you basically offer them up IPv6 information, And this doesn't replace what they're using for IP version 4, but Microsoft Windows will actually prefer DNS resolution over IP version 6 to IP version 4. So you're now the DNS server, and you can spoof WPAD and get password hashes. And the Cyber Mentor here in this link on YouTube is a very good explanation, very simplified on how to pull off this attack. And it's very complicated to remediate this. Yep, think local. It's very difficult to remediate because you can't just tell your client to turn it off. I've heard people say that in the past, and that's completely wrong. There's some Windows services that that actually depend on that, and you could break things. Awesome, Patrick. To remediate this, it basically requires defense in depth. For example, like maybe they could, a lot of times people will make an IP version 4 DHCP scope, but they'll ignore IP version 6. So if you configure IP version 6 scope, then they're not going to be constantly, like every few minutes, broadcasting to retrieve that information. Also, defense in depth things like segmenting your network, host-based firewalls blocking port 445 so that you can't relay this to other systems. Also, if you have anybody who's logged in with administrator credentials, you should be using drop boxes. I think Microsoft calls them privileged access workstations. And they should be using those privileged credentials on these firewalled off systems so that they're not broadcasting this across the whole user network. So it's definitely not as simple as just turning off IP version 6. It requires a lot of things behind the scenes to make this less dangerous. And this still works today. I don't see this getting fixed by Microsoft anytime soon. Dynamic routing protocols. This is something that no vulnerability scanner is generally going to pick up. These are dangerous defaults. Like for example, here we got HSRP, which is Hot Standby Router Protocol, I believe it stands for. And Cisco defaults to plaintext authentication with a password of Cisco. So basically, it enables a man-in-the-middle attack where you can take over as the primary router. It's very rare on pen tests that I've been allowed to, or I've chosen to try to exploit this, because a lot of the internal pen tests I've done, we were doing it remotely via Dropbox. And if you poison the network and poison the router, and you cut off your access, then you could cause a denial of service condition. So I would only attempt this under 2 conditions. First of all, I was sitting button seat, hands on the keyboard in that local office at my computer, where I could stop it if I needed to. And I would definitely ask permission before I did it from the client. But it's easy enough to find using TCP dump, running your Cinia. In fact, your Cinia will help you to exploit this. But if you're not already doing it, a packet capture should be the first thing that you do at the start of any internal assessment. Because then you'll find things like that we mentioned earlier, the IP version 6 broadcasts. You'll see LLM&R and the VTNS broadcast possibly, and things like this with HSRP default plaintext authentication with Cisco. You might also see things like routing protocols should not, in best case scenario, in a proper configuration. I believe Cisco states that you should not have routing protocols broadcasting on user segments, just on those links between routers. Printer default creds the domain admin. I've seen pen tests where we've done these pen tests back to back, year after year, and we find printers with the default Xerox admin credentials, and they don't bother to remediate it because they think, it's just a printer. What kind of damage can this do? Well, Daryl Highland did the original research on this, multifunction printers, Xerox and maybe some other brands. I remember the Xerox. but he coined the term passback attack. And so basically, if you find these, whether you're a system administrator or blue team or red team, check these printers. And if you find that they have default credentials, look to see if they have an LDAP connection. So LDAP can be Active Directory. It usually is, but it could also be Linux systems. But generally, if there's a printer LDAP connection, it'll be connected to a domain controller. And of all the times I've used this to gain higher privileges, has been many times. I've lost count how many times. Only one time has the credentials that they were using to connect to Active Directory not been a member of domain admin. So the way you would exploit this is, and by the way, Xerox patched this. Daryl Highland was the original discoverer and coined the passback attack. But like a decade later, I think it was just last year, I didn't realize that he had reported this about a particular model of Xerox printer because I didn't see that in any of his write-ups. So I reported it to Xerox to try to open a CVE, and not aware of the fact that he had already submitted that to them before that. But on the bright side, they finally patched this. Now their Xerox firmware will block this. And what it was allowing is if it had an LDAP connection to your LDAP server or Active Directory domain controller, it would allow you to change the IP address or host name of the LDAP server to be your own. Like you could put your own IP address or host name in there, and it would not prompt you to re-enter the credentials for that LDAP account they were using to connect to Active Directory. So imagine putting in your IP address or host name and then starting up Netcat on port 389, which is plain text for LDAP. And then somebody goes to log into the printer, or if the LDAP settings has a test where you can enter a username and have it test that lookup, it will send you the plain text password for the account that they're using to connect to Active Directory to do LDAP lookups. And like I mentioned earlier, out of all the times I found this on a pen test, only one time was the account they were using not a member of domain admins. And if you're not aware, you really don't need anything other than regular user credentials to do LDAP lookups on these printers. But for some reason, everybody thinks they had to be domain admin, and they were grossly overconfigured. Although Daryl Highland originally coined this passback attack and did the original research, I basically have tried this anytime I find any network devices with default creds. I always check to see if they have an LDAP connection. And here I've got a CVE found in Barracuda's email security gateway and web application firewall that have also been patched as of now. But anytime you find any network devices or systems with default credentials, check for LDAP connections or Active Directory connections for authentication, and see if you can hijack those to point to your system, use Netcat to capture the credentials. Credentials and open network shares. So this first line right here, CME at CrapMac exec, if you're not aware of that. I was doing a pen test on a hospital, and I found some weak shares that have basically allowed everyone, and in Active Directory, everyone is like even like just normal users. I think everyone also is non-authenticated. Correct me if I'm wrong in the chat here. But so I found this open network share that had like cancer patients, like MRIs and CAT scans and stuff like that. But GPP password, group policy preferences passwords, there's also a module in CrapMac exec for that. That rarely gets results, but it's still worth it to check because you never know. I remember years ago, you could, like every internal pen test, you could get administrator creds through this GPP password module at CrapMac exec. Also, Metasploit has an open NFS shares scanner. And then there's the classic IT shares that are open to all domain users. You know, if you add a $sign to the end of an Active Directory share name, it basically hides the share where if people are browsing a server like // hostname / and hit enter, and where it shows a list of shares. If you had a $ to the end of the share name, it won't make that share browsable that way. They'd have to directly type in the share name after the last / to view it. So they believe that their shares are hidden, so they think, why lock down the permissions? And there's been so many times I've found creds that have allowed me to escalate privileges to this. For example, sysprep XML files or unattended XML files that had local computer administrator credentials in them that run a share, a $ share, and that any user could browse to. Open NFS shares with where people would use, say, for example, VMware ESXi they were using that for storage for virtual machines, one of those NFS shares, or backups and stuff like that. Just manually digging through those for credentials. And I got to say that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to use KeePass or LAPS or whatever system to protect secrets if you're just going to leave them out there on an unsecured share. I've, through LLM&R and BTNS and WPAT in the past, gotten unprivileged user credentials, and when looking for a way to escalate privileges, I found another one of those $ shares for IT, and they had KeePass, and I couldn't guess the password for the KeePass database, which held all their IT system passwords. But why use KeePass if somebody's just going to export all those secrets to a CSV file and leave it in the same folder? LAPS, where LAPS basically randomizes every system's local administrator password. So if you find credentials for one, you can't spray those across the network. I found as a regular user that got into Citrix from outside the network, browse shares and find where a system administrator had a scheduled service that was using some PowerShell to automatically export all the LAPS administrator credentials for the whole domain to a CSV file. And then, it's easy enough to script that out and pwn them all, basically. So, no vulnerability scanner is normally going to find credentials in open network shares. And you can do some automated scanning using CME or Metasploit or whatever. But in the end, it's going to take some human interaction to basically look through these and dig around and try to find these secrets. But they're frequently overlooked just because scanners, like Nessus, for example, don't look for this stuff. Good old smart install. So there's a remote code execution vulnerability in Cisco Smart Install. And although this allows you to basically hack into Cisco routers and switches, password reuse is definitely a problem in a lot of organizations. And if you are able to find credentials in these network device configuration files, then you can frequently spray those against Active Directory, and they're using them for service accounts very frequently. So I've got the links here to the write-up on how this works, as well as the SIET tool to exploit this. When you exploit this, at the very minimum, if they're running Cisco Smart Install, you can download the device configurations of these Cisco routers and switches. If you find type 7 passwords in them, they can be, type 7 passwords can be easily decrypted in like a split second. So, if you can't crack those passwords, if they have type 7 in there, then you can reverse them pretty quickly. Definitely try those passwords against Active Directory and any other systems, because password reuse, if they're using like a local admin account password on their Cisco routers and switches, there's a good chance that the same person is setting that same password, maybe even the same username and password on other systems on the domain. In addition to downloading those configuration files, though, on some models of Cisco routers and switches, you can actually run commands. And so say, for example, if you were able to run a command, you could do a packet capture, download that packet capture, and then look for NTLM password hashes in those. But that runs on port 4786, and that's one of the first things I usually scan for when I start running Nmap on an internal assessment. Mouse jacking and a wireless assessment. There's been so many times I've done a wireless assessment. When I say wireless, 802.11 Wi-Fi, and so many times that this enterprise size network is using WPA2 instead of WPA Enterprise, and they think they're secure, and they are secure frequently if they're using a very long and complex password. And you try to educate them to use WPA Enterprise configured correctly, because with WPA2, a lot of organizations will fail to change those passwords to access the Wi-Fi when employees leave. So in this particular story, I was out at this unnamed client, and we find out that we're using WPA2, a pre-shared key. We were not able to crack the passwords, but we did get permission on the kickoff call to do client-side attacks. So I had a crazy radio PA USB dongle, and basically what this does is if you've got wireless peripherals like wireless mice and keyboards, and it's a vulnerable device. In fact, the devices that are known to be vulnerable are in that second from the last link for Bastille Research and Mousejack. And you can actually inject keystrokes over the airwaves and take control of those systems. Like, for example, the key press for the Windows key, then R to run a command, and all this runs by in a flash, and you've got remote code execution on a desktop or laptop system. And you'd be surprised how far the signal for these wireless peripherals can travel, depending on interference and in the building and what's around you and everything. It's very possible you can do this from a parking lot. So the downside of this, though, is that you can't tell who owns the affected systems, because all you're seeing is something that looks like a MAC address on the screen when you're running Mousejack. So you should definitely communicate with the client before you attack these systems over this. And I actually recommend that you ask for some of those wireless keyboards and mice to take them off-site. For example, if I'm on customer site, I'm probably staying in a hotel room. So I would borrow some and I would take them back to my hotel room where I know there's no other systems around, because if they're in a congested area and there's other businesses around, you really don't know who you're attacking. You could be attacking a whole other business located adjacent to this company. But a funny story about this, though, is the first time I actually got permission to do client-side attacks on a Wi-Fi assessment. Like I said, found WPA2 pre-shared key. We weren't able to crack it, so I broke out the crazy radio PA dongle. And at first I thought that I wasn't getting any results. I saw a bunch of systems scroll by on the screen that were potentially vulnerable. And when I picked one or two to try to exploit them, nothing was happening. So finally, I just had one of those YOLO moments. And it was a client that loved us, very friendly. They had a great sense of humor. So I figured I'll just try YOLO. And I'm thinking, got this office full of people. If I do a Rickroll on somebody, where I have my Ducky script that Mousejack uses to turn up their computer volume and then go to navigate their computer to YouTube in their browser and play the Rickroll video, that that would be confirmation that they're actually vulnerable. So I didn't take into account that that everybody in the office was using headphones or earplugs or whatever. So I ran this, I just shotgunned it against everybody and was listening. I didn't hear it, but then the point of contact came over to our desk and said, "Hey, do y'all know anything about this?" Somebody, they were working in Excel, and all of a sudden everything started flashing on the screen, and up pops YouTube and playing the Rickroll video. And she was really upset, and she grabbed her keyboard, because we were, injecting keystrokes. She thought it was the keyboard, but it actually was the mouse that was vulnerable. And she took it over to security and said, "I think somebody's hacked my keyboard." And later that day, we went over to another location where some engineers were working, and I was on the other side of the room running this and taking over people's computers. And you could have done it from outside too, but I ran it from inside the building anyway. And I saw somebody jump up and like looking around and scratching their head, and then they start banging on keys on the keyboard, and they couldn't get it to stop, so they just hit the power button and held it down and shut down their computer. So they were really tripping out over this. But it really made for an exciting assessment, and it went from a really boring Wi-Fi assessment to just their mind was blown. And so that was a fun time. But like I said, before we move on, always communicate with your client that you want to do client-side attacks. And even when that is denied, I'm not allowed to do client-side attacks, I will still run it, just analyzing anything, not doing any active attacks. Because if I find potentially vulnerable systems, I'll add these screenshots into the report narrative and call this out. And so I'm letting them know that on another assessment, they may want to investigate this and actually allow active testing. And it's sort of like a value-added thing for the report, even though you don't have a finding at that point. Blind cross-site scripting. So many times I've done web app pen tests where the web app had been scanned by, Burp Suite Pro by the developers, had been scanned by pentesters, been scanned by the security team, and then tested by multiple pentesters over time. And you're going through this and you're like, wow, big whoop, I'm finding cookie stuff, like low to moderate findings, and but not really much of anything else. So I always ask myself, what can I do to provide more value that nobody else is doing? And so now, after this, I always test for blind cross-site scripting, because I was doing a web app pen test for a bank or a financial institution, and their online banking system in production. I thought that there might be cross-site scripting vulnerabilities there, but as it was sending back my input to the page, and I was looking at the page source, they were properly it was encoded on the screen and everything. So I started thinking, like scratching my head, like, what can I do with this that nobody else has done? So I asked my point of contact, are there any back-end systems where you could view that's outside the scope of the system, for example, where you could view my system profile, or you can view any transactions that I did in your banking system? And so they said yes. So I spun up Beef, the browser exploitation framework, connected to the internet, and I had some Beef plugins set to run that would automatically screenshot the user's browser or whatever they're viewing when they get hooked by Beef. And so I set this up, and my point of contact basically, even though I wasn't detecting any cross-site scripting on the page I was testing, when he went into that backend administrative web app and was viewing my profile and viewing my transactions where I'd put this Beef cross-site scripting injection tag, I hooked him. And it sent me a screenshot from his browser of what he was viewing on that admin backend system when he viewed my profile. So since then, I'll do this on every web app assessment, and I'll leave Beef running connected to the internet, of course, with strong passwords. And I'll also whitelist their domain, like the domain of the website. And this has paid off more than once. I thought I was going to have a big nothing burger of a web app assessment, and you find blind cross-site scripting. So it's definitely worth doing this on every web app assessment. One of the things I think that provides value, and this is just an extra credit thing, because in the beginning of this talk, I mentioned how in the beginning I was just trying to not be lame and find whatever I could find that other people and scanners were overlooking. And after a while as a pen test consultant, you start to realize that there's a lot of value you can provide in the things that aren't there. The lack of a finding. How many internal networks do you think you could find where they don't have any host-based firewalls, everything's just a flat network? So these lack of things are can be findings in and of themselves, like lack of host-based firewalls, lack of network segmentation. Are they detecting your network scans? Is there any detection or response to adding privileged user accounts? And along those lines about adding privileged user accounts, say you get domain administrator on an assessment. Pretty much anybody, or most, I shouldn't generalize, but most are testing or monitoring for the addition of new domain administrator accounts. But you'd be surprised how many are not monitoring other privileged groups like enterprise administrators. So in addition to adding an account to domain administrators, I'll make another account by a different name and add it to enterprise administrators, and very frequently that gets overlooked. Lack of detection of response to password spraying, Kerberos attacks. Kerberos attacks, very difficult to detect because there's a lot of noise behind those. So Kerberos is a type of authentication on Active Directory networks, and a Kerberos attack. And by the way, I think that people who coined this and have put out a lot of research about this on can be found on a website called adsecurity.org. And so Kerberos attack is any user, any low privilege user in an Active Directory can use their credentials, or you can use their credentials, to pull a list of password hashes for service accounts. So they're called service principal names. A lot of Active Directory service accounts will use service principal names for authentication to, say, web applications or file shares and stuff like that. So by default, they'll use RC4 encryption they'll use RC4 encryption, and they'll encrypt it using the NTLM, using the password or the NTLM password, something like that. I don't remember all the fuzzy details. So with no privileged user accounts, just a plain domain user, you can run tools like getuserspns.py from Impacket and pull down these Kerberos password hashes for all their service accounts. And if you find some that are weak, you can crack those and use those to gain potentially domain admin or local administrator access to those systems. So even if you crack one of those passwords from a Kerberos attack, and they turn out to be not a member of Active Directory domain admins, which they frequently are, that's a common finding, is that overprivileged accounts, they just lump them all into domain admins because it makes it easier for the system administrators. But at the very least, those accounts should be local administrator on the system where the hashes came from. So when you pull these hashes, it'll have in the hash, it'll have the system name that it's valid for. So even if it's not a privileged user in Active Directory, try to use that cracked password to authenticate to that particular system. Always note in the report if the client's IDR, or any of their alerting from their SIM or whatever, caught your activity. I always tell my clients on the kickoff call and during subsequent communications that this is a pen test. It's not a red team assessment. So my goal is not to evade detection. But that being said, if you're catching my activity, I'd like for you to let me know. Send me screenshots, like email me screenshots of your alerts, because I'd like to give you credit where credit is due, that you're doing a great job. And you always want to point that out, that they're doing a great job. So this could be a finding as well. If you're doing all this activity and they're not detecting anything, hey, that's another finding. And please do share. This is my Twitter account here, obviously on the screen. If you have anything that I've overlooked, anything that was wrong, or you've got some great attacks that aren't typically caught by scanners, please do share. Share the wealth, and we can all learn from it. But other than that, though, are there any questions or comments at this point?
Steve, one of the questions that came in was, aren't host-based firewalls high on cost of implementation or maintenance with regard to bang for the buck?
It takes a lot more work because you have to know your network. And unfortunately, I think a lot of our clients we've seen don't know everything that's going on in their network. So you have to know what is valid network traffic and what should be allowed to connect. You need to be using privileged access workstations or jump boxes for admin accounts, for example, and have those systems, the admins do their elevated privileges, have those firewalled off in separate networks. This is just part of defense in depth. So it is a lot of work. A lot of times system administrators or engineers are overworked. They don't have enough people, don't have enough time or whatever. But in an enterprise network, it's definitely worth extra time and effort if you can afford it, to to plan and know what should be traversing your network. For example, Windows clients, like if you're on the same network, why does one Windows 10 client need to connect to another one? It shouldn't. If you're not serving file shares from client operating systems, you should be sharing file servers from servers, and hopefully in a server VLAN that's separate. Then the Windows 10 host shouldn't need to connect to SMB port 445 on other Windows 10 hosts, so that should be blocked. So it really requires a lot more work, and that's why it's frequently not done. The very, very few times that I have seen host-based firewalls where they put in this type of effort to do this, made it extremely hard to move through the network. You compromise one host, and then good luck trying to advance onto other hosts because they've got host-based firewalls. So it's a lot of work, but it also pays off big time in your defense for your blue team to actually put in that work. But unfortunately, it's just extremely rare.